Joining us right now to talk about all of this, as well as today's potential voting in the Senate in terms of semiconductor funding, is Alaska Senator Dan Sullivan. And Senator, thanks for being here. You've been a pretty vocal critic.
Good to be here, Becky.
Good to see you. You've been a pretty vocal critic of the administration's policies on energy to date. What do you think of this latest trip?
Look, there was a lot of attention on the fist pump, and the markets obviously weren't impressed yesterday with oil going up. But I think the trip, in many ways, really highlighted the colossal strategic mistake of the Biden administration's energy policy. It's hard to think of a sector of the U.S. economy or of American interests, national security, energy security, inflation, working families, even the environment and emissions that have not been undermined by this administration's policy, which was to unilaterally disarm with regard to American energy production, which has the highest standards in terms of our environmental protection of any other place in the world, certainly higher than Saudi Arabia. And the president showed up there from a position of weakness. And, Becky, it didn't have to be this way. I mean, we're in this new era of authoritarian aggression led by Xi Jinping in China and Putin in Russia. And just like we were the arsenal of democracy during World War II, we can be the world's reliable energy supplier, particularly to the free world right now. That's something that Russia and China fear, American energy dominance. And yet the president showed up from a position of weakness. And I think it certainly showed with the Saudi statements, particularly at the end, saying, hey, our decision is going to be based on what OPEC Plus decides in terms of production levels. And as you know, OPEC Plus includes Russia. And that was a subtle way of saying we're going to listen to Vladimir Putin more than Joe Biden. So I think in that perspective, it was a failure.
A few years ago, the United States was the largest producer of energy, both oil and natural gas, when you add these things up. We lost that lead in large part because of what happened with the free market. When oil prices went negative, we got out of that business. But there have been a lot of things the administration has done since then that have maybe made it more complicated. What do you think it would take in order to get us back to that position?
I think it just takes reversing what this administration has done since day one. As you know, they've sought to limit production. They've made it in America. They've made it really hard to permit pipelines, whether it's LNG permits for terminals, whether it's pipelines to move energy like Keystone. They've slow rolled that. They've gone to the financial sector and strong-arm them not to invest in the American energy sector, which is remarkable. And then they've almost throughout the entire financial area in terms of senior administration officials that they're appointing, they have had this goal of choking off capital to the American energy sector. So if they reversed on these key areas that I just mentioned, which have been their policies since day one, I think you'll see the energy sector move back to where you were talking about, American energy dominance. That will be good for inflation to come down. That will be good for working families. That will certainly be good for our national security. Our allies need American energy all over the world. And right now, the image of the president going to Saudi Arabia and begging another dictatorship, whether it's Venezuela or Iran, now the Saudis, for more energy, it's not the right policy, and it undermines American interests across the board. But it could be reversed, and I think they need to do that.
Senator Sullivan, it used to be that the solution to high prices was high prices. The higher the price got, the more attractive it would make it for companies to kind of put money in and say, we're going to drill more, we're going to find more of these things. There have been a lot of things that have happened, including the ESG movement, where basically they've gone after oil companies and said, we don't want you to drill more, we want you to give more money back to the investors. And then you also have this threat of, okay, we're going to be moving away from fossil fuel, and we're trying to do that as a global economy. If that's the case, it doesn't make sense to spend billions and billions of dollars on projects that would take many, many years to recoup just the money that you invested into it.
Yeah.
Have we just reached a turning point where the free market doesn't work in this industry anymore?
No, I don't believe that, Becky. And whether it's the Biden administration's own information or Energy Information Agency, the IEA in Paris, they all unequivocally state that we're going to be needing oil and gas for decades to come. That is a fact. And so if you need that, why shouldn't we produce it in America with the highest standards on the environment, highest standards on workers? And here's another thing with the administration that's so frustrating. There's a lack of seriousness when you look at some of the cabinet officials on the Biden administration. When they talk about this, their go-to talking point right now, whether it's the Secretary of Energy, Secretary of Interior, Secretary of Transportation, is, hey, we need to rapidly move to electric vehicles. Okay, just listen to them. That's what they say almost every time. That's not a serious talking point. It's not a serious policy prescription when you look at the challenges that we have in the energy sector. But to your point, it is a long-term investment industry, and we need to be able to provide that environment for long-term investment. We're going to be needing energy for decades to come. We should be producing it in America that has the highest standards in the world across the board on so many things that are important to Americans, like the environment.
Senator, what do you make? We had Tom Cotton on the program last week. He made a comment effectively that he believes the BlackRocks of the world, that all sorts of CEOs are doing things that he actually believes are illegal. In fact, at one point he suggested that some CEOs may go to jail over their approach to ESG.
Yeah, I don't see the going to jail point. As you know, Andrew, I've been very focused on the issue of the voting capacity of the big index funds like BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard. As a matter of fact, you may have seen the Senate Banking Committee held a hearing on my Index Act, which I've talked to you guys about a number of times before on your show. We had a hearing. It was a really good hearing on this big issue. The issue is the power that these index funds have amassed and whether or not they should be able to vote the shares that they actually don't really own. The beneficial shareholders, in my view, are the ones who should be able to vote those shares. I think that's the best approach with regard to dealing with ESG. I think it's democratizing American corporate governance.
Senator,
that's what I've been focused on.
One of the things that's been fascinating, and Larry Fink has been described as a hypocrite for this, which is to say that in his letters, he often pushes lots of climate-focused issues. You might even describe it as agendas. And yet he gets criticized repeatedly by the climate side, if you would, for not voting the shares the same way necessarily is described in the letter. And so from a practical perspective, you could argue that he's actually doing what you would want.
Well, look, I think the CEOs of those big investment funds take it from both sides, the left and the right, depending on the issue, depending how they vote. I think the broader issue, as I've raised with you guys before, is not so much what the policy of the day is, it's the market dominance that they have. Corporate voting was never meant to consolidate so much power in so few hands. And I think even the leadership of those investment funds are starting to recognize that this is not an area they want to be in. You know, managing $21 trillion in assets, voting on over 25% of all public shares in America. That's not a healthy corporate governance market for our country. And what it does, it leads to distortions to where different groups, a lot of times far left woke groups, in my view, go to these firms and say, hey, we want to get policies passed through you guys that we can't get passed here in the Congress. I don't think anyone thinks that's healthy for our capital markets, which is why my legislation, the index fund, is gaining a lot of interest on both sides of the aisle in a lot of areas in corporate America.
Hey, Senator, what's a good Republican supposed to think of the CHIPS Act? Is it corporatist subsidies for a favored industry that'll end up, taking on the attributes of the federal government, being inefficient and using capital poorly, or is it a partnership between the private sector and the public sector that will work for the good of everyone? Where are you on that? And what should Republicans do? Is it going to pass? It's bipartisan.
Well, Joe, here's what I think of that. And you may have seen there was actually a Wall Street Journal editorial that was critical today. There's certain key industries. Energy is one of them. Chip manufacturing, fabrication, in my view, is another. But this is really an outgrowth of the awakening that we've had here in the Congress on the problems and challenges that have been going on for decades with regard to trading with and having a behemoth economy like the China economy that is not open, that is not free. I'm all for free market competition, open and free trade, except with regard to one country, and it's China. And they cheat, and they subsidize, and they coerce, and they steal. And having a country of that size in the global economy, in my view, you can't undertake business as usual. So that is what this CHIPS Act is an outgrowth of. How do we compete and outcompete the Chinese when they don't play when they don't play fair and they don't play by market competition rules? So that is where that is. I've been working on elements of this bill. We'll see. We might even have a vote on the beginning of the process to move it later this evening. I'm going to take a hard look at it, but that's what's happening. So from a Republican perspective, I believe in open trade, free trade, competition, market, capitalism, with the exception of China. And that's the awakening that's happened here, and it's quite bipartisan.
We need the S&P 500 needs subsidies then, because China competes unfairly with across the board with all of our companies. So does everyone need help?
China does. Well, look, you're raising a good point. What's the limiting principle here? China does compete unfairly across the board on a whole host of industries. I would say that it's looking at very strategic industries for our national security, our economic security. The chips manufacturing certainly is one. But these aren't easy answers. I'm not saying there's an easy answer to this, but what you're seeing right now is the reaction, and I think a healthy awakening to just how unfair and non-reciprocal our relationship economically has been with regard to China. And I think there's policy reasons that we need to undertake to address that. And in my view, this is one that's important. We'll see what the final contours of the bill are later today, and then I'll decide whether or not I'm going to vote for it or not.
Okay. Senator, I want to thank you very much for being with us today. It's good to see you.
Yeah.
Becky, always a pleasure. Thanks.